Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History by Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor Bartosz Adamczewski. And today's topic is based on Bartosz's book titled Heirs of the Reunited Church, the history of the Pauline mission in Paul's letters, in the so-called pastoral letters, and in the pseudo-Titus narrative Acts. I'll have the affiliate link to purchase the book in the description below and also in the pinned comment as well. So we're going to be discussing Bartosz's view on the historical Paul, especially regarding the chronology of the historical Paul and things of that nature. So welcome back to the show, Bartosz.
Mm-hmm. Good to see you again, and good to see all the viewers who are present now. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
You want to? So you have a presentation you want to share with the audience. So
yes, maybe I will start with a presentation, and then we will come to questions and a discussion. Maybe it's easier for me just to show you first the presentation and then some comments on it, and then we will go to the discussion. So I will start with the presentation. Just a moment.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
I'll wait till you have it on full screen, and then I'll put it up.
Yes, just a moment. Yeah, it's full screen now. Yeah. I hope that you can see the presentation, chronology of Paul's life and its bearing on his theology.
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah,
I do.
Okay. So let's start. The issue of the relative chronology of Paul's life, as it may be deduced from Paul's own letters, is closely related to the question of the relative order of the composition of these letters. The latter issue was first explicitly addressed by Theodoret of Cyrus, who opted, mainly on the basis of the contents of the Pauline letters, for the following sequence, as you can see here on the screen. If the letters that are widely regarded today as not authentic are removed from the sequence, the following pattern emerges: 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, Philippians, and Philemon. My own research quite closely follows the first attempt that was made centuries ago by Theodoret of Cyrus, who lived in the 4th, 5th century. So my research only, the only difference is in the two last letters. I think that the letter of Philippians was written as the last one. So the sequence is almost the same. What is important here that Theodoret of Cyrus based his hypothesis of the relative sequence of both letters only on the contents of these letters, not on the Acts of the Apostles. So what we should do today is simply forget Acts. Just base our thinking on Paul's letters. I think that the Acts of the Apostles was written several decades later than the letters themselves. And that is why, in order to understand Paul, we should first start with his letters written by himself, the authentic letters of Paul, and only later come to Acts. And do not regard both letters and Acts as two independent sources. I think that the only source that we really have is the letters, and Acts is not really a source. It's a narrative written decades later, I think already in the 2nd century, together with Richard Pervo and others. I date Acts to 130, 140, so much later than the letters themselves, almost 100 years, almost a century later. So we should start with the letters and try to understand the letters as we have them. And only later, at the later stage of our thinking, we should come to Acts. This is a mental exercise, but this is very important for the reconstruction of Paul's life. If we take Acts as our first guide, we just land in nowhere land. We do not understand. We understand neither the letters nor the Acts. So let's start with the letters as we have them. Virtually all New Testament scholars assume that Paul traveled to Jerusalem after his call at least 3 times. The first visit after his flight from Damascus, the so-called acquaintance visit described in Galatians 1, then the second at the conference with the Jerusalem pillars, the so-called conference visit described in Galatians 2, and the third one with the contribution of the Gentile churches for the poor in Jerusalem, the so-called offering or collection. This is the standard view which is accepted by most scholars today. It should be noted, however, that the first part of the somewhat enigmatic Pauline statement, Galatians 2:10, I have written here in Greek on the screen. You can read it. I hope that you can understand Greek. Refers to the obligation that was issued by the Jerusalem pillars and imposed over Paul and Bartosz, namely that the latter should remember the poor. Monon ton tohon hinamenemoneon. Its following formulation, with the use of the form of present conjunctive, hinamenemoneon, suggests that the action of remembering was ongoing, progressive in its aspect value, and undefined as concerns its temporal value. The meaning of Paul's subsequent statement, hokai espudas auto tuto poiesai, Galatians 2:10b, is not entirely clear. Most scholars understand it as referring to the fundraising activity that, as it is assumed, began in response to the demands of the Jerusalem pillars. It should be noted, however, that the two aorist forms used in Galatians 2:10b, espudasa and poiesai, suggest that the collection was already somehow completed, at least in the mind of Paul, at the time of writing of the letter to Galatians. Moreover, the emphatic, demonstrative pronominal phrase auto tuto in Galatians 2:10b refers to the fundraising activity regarded not as resulting from the Jerusalem agreement, but as preceding it and as meeting exactly its requirements. So we have an important point here that Paul describes in Galatians 2. He describes his collection as already accomplished and not as ongoing, progressive in the future. So this is one of the crucial arguments that I have here, that we should regard the collection in Galatians as already completed. And that is why we do not have two second and third visits. We only have the second visit, the collection visit, which is also the conference visit. And that is why I argue that Paul visited Jerusalem only 2 times after his call for his conversion. The first time when he met Cephas for 15 days, and the second one when he came with the money for the Jerusalem poor among the saints. So there were only 2 visits of Paul in Jerusalem, and not 3 or more. 3 as it is usually assumed by Pauline scholars, and more as it is presented in the Acts of Apostles. The Acts multiplies Paul's visits in Jerusalem for Lucan theological reasons. If this is the case, that Paul visited Jerusalem only 2 times after his call, then we have 2 major periods in Paul's life. The hypothesis of only 2 Paul's visits to Jerusalem after his call is further corroborated by a number of observations concerning the differences between the 2 basic stages in Paul's missionary activity. We have the post-Antiochene period in contrast to the pre-Antiochene period. I divide Paul's activity into 2 great periods. The pre-Antiochene period, which means before the Antiochene clash with Cephas, Barnabas, and others, and the post-Antiochene period. And I argue that 4 letters were written before this clash: 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans, and 3 letters were written in the aftermath or after this clash at Antioch: Galatians, Philemon, and Philippians. So if Paul's second or conference visit to Jerusalem was also his last one, the so-called collection one, then the whole missionary career of the apostle after his first visit to the Holy City may be divided into 2 distinct stages: the pre-Antiochene one and the post-Antiochene one. Accordingly, it may be reasonably assumed that First Thessalonians, First Corinthians, Second Corinthians, and Romans were written during the pre-Antiochian period of post-missionary activity, whereas Galatians, Philemon, and Philippians were written during the last post-Antiochian stage of Paul's life. In fact, a number of significant differences between these two periods and the two corresponding to them groups of letters may be observed. So I have listed here 6 plus 5, it's 11 main differences between these two stages in post-missionary career, before the Antiochian clash and after the Antiochian incident. And we will follow them one after another. We have a list here, and then let's start with the first one. The Eucharistic schism in the Church with no perspective for reconciliation. The first and most important difference between the pre-Antiochian stage of post-missionary activity and the post-Antiochian period lies in breaking the table fellowship between the Jewish and the Gentile believers in Christ, which was a precondition for their common participation in the Eucharist in the aftermath of the Antiochian crisis. The problem of table fellowship with the allegedly idolatrous and impure Gentiles, which scandalized believers who remained under the influence of more conservative Jewish Christian ideas, arose already before the Antiochian crisis. However, at that stage, Paul assumed that this problem might be resolved, at least partially, by mutual respect, self-limitation, acceptance, and love in Christ. Consequently, at that stage, the Jewish-Gentile Christian Eucharistic communion could be preserved, with reference to the one body of Christ. So we have the pre-Antiochian stage here at the top of the screen, so to say, one body of Christ. This was the solution of Paul before the Antiochian clash. Let's remain together and be one body of Christ with different members. The Antiochian crisis revealed that the supporters of James did not accept this kind of post-theological halakhic argumentation. They broke the table fellowship between the Jewish believers and the Gentile Christians. The letters to the Galatians, to Philemon, and to the Philippians show no trace of reconciliation of Paul with James, Cephas, and Barnabas after the Antiochian crisis. At this stage, Paul referred to the Jewish missionaries as dogs, evil workers, and mutilation. We have here blepete to skinas, blepete to skakusergatas, blepete and katatumen, very offensive terms. Moreover, the allusions to Galatians 2 in the Gospels of Mark and Luke, which are very confrontational in their contents, suggest that the schism lasted at least until AD 100, AD 120. So at least until the second century. All the highly sophisticated Ethiopic solutions to the problem, which are contained in the Lucan and other New Testament writings, would have been entirely unnecessary if the problem had been solved during Paul's third collection visit to Jerusalem, in a way presented, for example, in Acts 21-25. So I argue that until the end of Paul's life, and probably until now, the Eucharistic schism was not removed from the church. It lasted between the Pauline Christians and the Jewish followers of James. There was no reconciliation in reality. The solution that is offered, for example, by Luke in the Acts of the Apostles, which is a very ironic writing promoting peace in the church, is a literary, theological solution, but it's not a historical one. In reality, in historical reality, there was no solution, no reconciliation, so to say, after this Antiochian clash. The second important difference between the pre-Antiochian stage of post-missionary activity and the post-Antiochian one lies in different aims of both opponents at both these stages. Before the Antiochian crisis, Paul's opponents questioned persuasive ability, apostolic authority, Jerusalem-based authorization, theological halakhic orthodoxy, as well as moral integrity and financial honesty of the apostle. Accordingly, it was Paul's position and authority in the churches that had been founded by him that was at stake at this stage. So we have the pre-Antiochian stage here at the top of the screen. After the Antiochian crisis, the issue of bodily circumcision became the most important factor that divided Paul and his opponents. In contrast to the earlier stage, at which Paul argued that the issue of bodily circumcision is not crucial for justification and salvation, and we have texts about it in 1 Corinthians and Romans, after his second visit to Jerusalem, the apostle had to defend his Gentile believers against serious attempts, anankazo in Greek, to circumcise them, forcing the Gentiles to be circumcised. What was at stake at this stage, the second stage, was most probably an attempt to bring the Gentile churches, which had been founded by Paul, under the control of the Jerusalem community. According to the agreement reached in Jerusalem, and we know it from Galatians 2, the Jerusalem pillars were supposed to exercise authority over the circumcised believers. So they divided the realm of the world mission, so to say, into two realms, circumcision and uncircumcision. If the communities, first in Antioch, later in Galatia and Macedonia, and presumably also in Cilicia, Achaia, and Asia, would be somehow compelled by Paul's opponents to adopt Jewish observances, they would legitimately come under the jurisdiction of the Jerusalem community. So I argue that the followers of James acted according to the Jerusalem agreement reached with Paul and Barnabas. They forced the Gentiles to be circumcised in order to bring them under the legal, so to say, control of the Jerusalem community. So their attempts were quite understandable after the Jerusalem agreement that they reached with Paul and Barnabas. The third important difference between the pre-Antiochian stage of Paul's missionary activity and the post-Antiochian one is constituted by the profound difference in Paul's perception of the status of Jerusalem before and after the Antiochian crisis. Before the Antiochian crisis, Jerusalem was perceived by Paul as a very important point of reference for his overall apostolic activity. Paul described Jerusalem, at least in his letter to Romans, as the starting point and the spiritual center of his entire ministry. At this stage, Jerusalem was always referred to by Paul with the use of the sacred Hebraized name Jerusalem, which was used in the vast majority of the works included in the Septuagint. Accordingly, the Jewish Christian recipients of the Gentile collection were described by Paul at this stage as the saints, or the poor among the saints. So we have both the name Jerusalem and the Hagioi, the saints, as the recipients of Paul's collection. After the Antiochian crisis, Jerusalem was perceived by the apostle as a place that should be avoided, whose status was tantamount to slavery. At this stage, the city was referred to by Paul with the use of the more Hellenized, and hence presumably considered by the apostle more profane, name Hierosolima, no more Jerusalem, but Hierosolima. The exception to this rule was made by the apostle in Galatians 4, but I will not come into detail with this text. At this stage, the Jewish Christian recipients of the Gentile collection were described by Paul no more as the saints, or the poor among the saints, but simply as the poor. We have this in Galatians 2. So they were simply poor, no more saints. So we have the change in terminology. Before the Antiochian clash, we have Jerusalem and the saints. After the Antiochian crisis, we have Hierosolima and no more saints, but simply poor. Another significant difference between the pre-Antiochian stage of Paul's missionary activity and the post-Antiochian one lies in Paul's different perception of his citizenship at both stages. In fact, this difference corresponds to the preceding one. Before the Antiochian crisis, Paul acknowledged his Hebrew Israelite nationality and even boasted of it, although he perceived this kind of identity as belonging merely to the realm of the flesh. After the Antiochian crisis, the apostle regarded his Israelite Hebrew nationality as being worth as much as garbage. Accordingly, he perceived himself as having his citizenship not in the earthly Israel, but in heaven. One of the most important differences between the pre-Antiochian and the post-Antiochian stage of Paul's missionary activity lies in Paul's different attitude to Cephas before and after the Antiochian crisis. Before the Antiochian crisis, Cephas was referred to by Paul with respect as the main witness of Christ's resurrection, although a part of the Corinthians perceived Cephas as a rival to Paul, and although Paul in fact criticized Cephas as not meeting the highest standards of personal commitment to the gospel, taking wife, money, and so on. After the Antiochian crisis, Cephas was referred to by Paul at best neutrally. He was recognized by Paul not as a generally acknowledged Jewish Christian leader, but only in his function of the main Jewish Christian apostle, who was legitimated by God inasmuch as he was a missionary of the gospel, and who was for this reason referred to with the use of the Hellenized equivalent name Petros. Notwithstanding his high position in the Jewish Christian community, which could counterbalance the extremely influential position of James, the Lord's brother, Cephas was sharply rebuked by Paul for his being a merely apparent pillar, and in particular for his cowardly refusal to defend Paul's liberal halakhic attitude to the Gentiles and consequently to the entire law against the opinion of the supporters of James in Antioch. There is no reason to suppose that Paul's severe public reprimand for Cephas, which resulted in Paul's leaving Antioch, was simply forgotten by the other side of the conflict as an event of minor importance. Paul was brought up in the Mediterranean culture, knew very well that after his fierce clash with the supporters of James and with Cephas, he had no possibility of returning to Judea and to Antioch. He could only hope to retain the communities in Galatia, Macedonia, and Achaia, which were founded by him under his influence. However, this prospect was in fact also very uncertain, as the contents of the letters to the Galatians and to the Philippians reveal. Another difference between the pre-Antiochian and the post-Antiochian stages lies in the thoroughly changed Paul's attitude to Barnabas after the Antiochian crisis. Before the Antiochian crisis, Paul regarded Barnabas as his important missionary partner who met, together with Paul, the highest standards of personal commitment to the gospel. No wife, no money, etc. Accordingly, Paul hoped that Barnabas would wholeheartedly support his position concerning the halakhic attitude to the Gentile believers in Christ. After the Antiochian crisis, Paul characterized Barnabas as a play actor, Hippocrates, who even if reluctantly and half-heartedly actually betrayed Paul's case against the supporters of James. We will skip the reference to Titus. This is not the most important one. What is more interesting is the difference which lies in Paul's different attitude to the financial argument as potentially persuasive for the Jerusalem community. Before the Antiochian crisis, Paul hoped that the Gentile collection for the saints in Jerusalem would ease the tension between him and his Jewish Christian opponents. He hoped that the money would help somehow defend his position against his Jewish Christian opponents. After the Antiochian crisis, which included a public reprimand for Cephas, Paul could not have expected to appease the publicly offended party simply by means of a financial contribution for the Jerusalem poor, even if it were accompanied by the intercession of the distant community in Rome. Therefore, he referred to his collection for the poor as an activity which had been concluded in the past, exactly meeting the later request of the Jerusalem pillars. So in fact, already finished. Hokai espúdaza auto tuto ujese. Paul, who was brought up in the Mediterranean culture, knew very well that the general financial support for the Jerusalem saints would not suffice to placate the publicly offended pillars. And another important difference between the pre-Antiochian and the post-Antiochian stage lies in the different intended destination of the funds that were collected by the Pauline communities before and after the Antiochian crisis. Before the Antiochian crisis, the apostle raised funds for the saints in Jerusalem, and we have references to this collection in 2 Corinthians and Romans and so on. Paul justified this particular action as expressing not only a gift of generous love, but also a moral duty of Gentile Christians towards Christ and towards their Jewish Christian brethren in faith. Moreover, Paul stressed in various ways that the collection that was ordered by him was destined not for his own use, but exclusively for the needs of the saints in Jerusalem. Accordingly, the apostle could boast, notwithstanding his receiving support from the Macedonian communities, that he notably differed from his rivals who collected funds also for their own maintenance, and who justified such actions as resulting from the moral duty of the believers towards the apostles, who were authorized by the Jerusalem community. After the Antiochian crisis, Paul regarded his financial obligation to the Jerusalem community, in contrast to that of Barnabas, as having already been fulfilled by his bringing to Jerusalem the funds from the Macedonian and Achaean communities, which were collected by Titus and entrusted to him. Exactly what I had hastened to do, precisely this very thing. Galatians 2:10. At this stage, Paul suggested to the communities that had been founded by him that, as a recompense for the gift of faith, they should raise funds for the one who taught them the word of God. Koinoneitode, ho katechumenos ton logon, to katechonti and passing agathois. Usually, scholars just understand this verse in a very general way. However, I argue that instead of supporting the poor in Jerusalem, they should now financially support their chief teacher Paul in his present need. It was Paul who was the katechon, the one who taught them the word, and they should support him, not the Jerusalem believers, but him, Paul, now, when he was imprisoned, probably already or going to Rome. It is worth noting that Paul described this fundraising activity of his communities, which was rhetorically presented by him as morally binding, with the use of the same partnership, agricultural, and cultic terminology that described the earlier, likewise morally obligatory collection for the saints in Jerusalem, koinoneo and koinonia, speiro terizo, and liturgeo liturgia. So we have a shift in the flow of money from the Jerusalem saints to Paul himself. One of the most striking differences between the pre-Antiochian stage of Paul's missionary activity and the post-Antiochian one lies in the number of nationality of Paul's friends in Rome. Before the Antiochian crisis, Paul had a number of friends in the capital of the empire, several of whom were Paul's compatriots. We have a long list in Romans 16 of those who were greeted by Paul in Rome. After the Antiochian crisis, if it is reasonably assumed that at least Philemon and Philippians were written from Rome, as is argued by numerous scholars today, Paul was accompanied in the capital of the empire only by Timothy, Epaphras, Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, as his closest co-workers, as well as by some unnamed, presumably Gentile brethren, especially those who belonged to the emperor's household. We have a reference to them in Philippians 4. It is significant that during his imprisonment, Paul could not count on support from the local Christian community in Rome, but he had to receive funds from the distant church in Philippi, in Macedonia, to Rome, which is very far away. Likewise, the post-Pauline tradition concerning Paul's being abandoned in Rome, especially by Jewish Christians, we have remarks concerning this abandonment in Colossians and 2 Timothy, would be completely inexplicable if Paul's Roman imprisonment were preceded by his third reconciliation visit to Jerusalem. So again, I argue that there was no reconciliation with Cephas and Barnabas and the Jerusalem leaders, and that is why he was not welcomed by the Roman community. He was treated at best neutrally there, and he needed money from the distant community in Philippi, in Macedonia, when he was imprisoned in Rome. Another important difference lies in a different direction of Paul's planned or hoped for future missionary activity. Before the Antiochian crisis, Paul considered the eastern part of the empire as already generally evangelized by his missionary activity that ranged from Jerusalem to Syria, Cilicia, Galatia, Macedonia, and Achaia to Illyricum. We have mention of it in Romans 15. For this reason, the apostle intended to leave the relatively unproblematic east and go farther west, as far as Spain. So he went like tsunami from the east to the west, from Jerusalem to Spain. And in this way, he hoped that he would evangelize the whole world within 14 plus 14 means 28 years, approximately. After the Antiochian crisis, Paul perceived the earlier evangelized by him communities in the eastern part of the empire, especially in Galatia and Macedonia, as threatened by the Judaizers, and for this reason being in need of his presence and of his strengthening them. Accordingly, the apostle desired, or at least hoped, to come back to the churches that had been founded by him at the earlier stage. So there was no more Spain. Paul realized that his desire to return to the east was at that moment not possible due to external constraints, in particular due to his imprisonment. Nevertheless, although he was in prison, his desire was no more to go to Spain, to the west, but to come back to the east and strengthen the communities which were endangered by his Jewish opponents. So, we may make an attempt to reconstruct the relative chronology of Paul's life, following simply the contents of his own letters, forgetting Acts, but simply taking the letters, the authentic letters as we have. So the first item, the first event is Paul's revelation call. I would argue that it happened around 33, in the year 33 approximately, and we have two descriptions, two references to this revelation call in 2 Corinthians and in Galatians. I argue that 2 Corinthians 12 refers to the same event that is described in Galatians 1. There are no two different ecstatic events, so to say. It's the same event that is described in two different ways in 2 Corinthians and in Galatians 1. Then his journey to Arabia, and then his flight from Damascus to Jerusalem. And then we have the first visit in Jerusalem, which is described in Galatians 1:18. Then after the first visit in Jerusalem, he went to Syria and Cilicia, to Galatia, Macedonia, Achaia, Asia, and Illyricum. So today, Turkey and Greece, up to Albania, so to say. And at this stage, he wrote 4 letters: 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. Then before the second visit in Jerusalem, tensions with Jewish opponents, response, collection for the saints in Jerusalem, reason for travel, revelation. He was compelled, so to say, by God to come back to Jerusalem. He did not want to go there. We have a great contrast between his letters and Acts. In Acts, every few steps that he moves forward, he comes back to Jerusalem to consult with the Jerusalem pillars. In his letters, he did not want to come back to Jerusalem. He was forced by God, by revelation, to come back to Jerusalem. And this was his collection to the saints, for the saints in Jerusalem. And then Titus taken along, an example of a Gentile Christian. And during the second visit in Jerusalem, we had this famous division of missionary realms, circumcision and uncircumcision, then the financial request of the Jerusalem pillars, and Paul's answer that it had already been fulfilled by him. Barnabas should think about his money, but Paul argues, "Auto tuto, I have already done the thing that you request from me." And then the following Antiochian crisis and the clash with Cephas and Barnabas. And after the second visit in Jerusalem, the journey through Asia to Rome, which we have described or referred to in the pastorals in Titus and 1st, 2nd Timothy. What is important here, that he traveled to Rome as a free person, not as a prisoner. The pastorals assume that he went to Rome as a free man. It is Luke who presents him as a prisoner coming to Rome. In his letters, we have him as a free person who comes to Rome. Then the imprisonment in Rome, and then the Jerusalem-related opponents in Rome who are active here. We have reference to them in Philippians and also in 1st Clement, and his death in Rome due to envy of the Jewish Christian brothers in Rome. And at the second stage, we have the three letters, Galatians, Philemon, and Philippians. And now we can trace some development in Paul's theology. The issue of circumcision became a strongly divisive factor only after the Antiochene conflict with the Jerusalem leaders. So we have references to this problem only in Galatians and in Philippians, so not before, which is important, that the divisive issue of circumcision only became really divisive after the Antiochene conflict. The second very important difference is that the question of justification was important for Paul only at a certain stage of his theological thinking in Romans and Galatians, in contrast to the claims of mainstream Protestant theology, which presents Paul as always thinking about justification. No, I argue, not just because I'm a Catholic, no. I think that when we read Paul's letters, the issue of justification is only important in Romans and Galatians. So in the central, so to say, part of his ministry, because of the arguments of his opponents, we have almost no references to justification in the earliest letters and in the latest letters of Paul. So it is not a certain issue in Paul's theology. It only became important at a certain stage of his life. And then another question, which letter of the apostle is the most mature one? Most scholars argue that it is the letter of the Romans. I think that also because of Luther's commentary to Romans and Thomas Aquinas and Luther's commentaries to Romans. So these commentaries, Thomas Aquinas one and then Luther's one, persuaded scholars that Romans is the heart of Paul's theology. However, even if this letter, Romans, functions as the best, systematic, most organized, I would argue, academic presentation of Paul's theology, it is not the most mature one in terms of spirituality. In fact, it is the letter to the Philippians, which is the last one among Paul's authentic letters, and which functions as his last will and testament. In Philippians, Paul seriously considers the possibility of dying soon. He sums up his whole life, and he asks whether his decision to invest his whole life in the service of Christ brought him gain or loss. If we want to analyze Paul's theology not as a set of static propositions, as is usually done by Pauline scholars, taken indiscriminately from various parts of Paul's letters, we need to follow the sequence of his letters, especially taking into consideration the most important difference between the pre-Antiochene and the post-Antiochene stages in Paul's life. In this way, we will understand Paul's theology in its development, leading from Paul's earliest, simply friendly, first letter to the Thessalonians, through the rise of the tension with his opponents during the 14 years of his activity in Asia Minor and Greece, to the painful aftermath of his second visit in Jerusalem, when he defended his heritage, strengthened his communities against the attempts to bring them under the control of Judean leaders, and prepared his communities for his death and absence. As we can see, this living theologizing of the apostle has brought much fruit, which lasts forever. Thank you very much for your attention. Now I stop sharing the screen.
So my first question that I'd like to get started with is when you place Philemon and Philippians after the composition of Galatians. Where was Paul's imprisonment occurring? Or so-called imprisonment? Did he come back to Rome or something? And you mentioned the pastoral letters. It mentions that he's a free man, contradicting the later tradition that he was already brought in chains in Rome. He was not. Um, so what's going on there?
Okay, I really don't know where was Galatians written. Where? Probably somewhere on his way to Rome, but we do not know. It cannot be simply regarded as a prison letter, because there are no direct or clear references to the imprisonment in Galatians. There are marks of suffering, but we have no clear references to any imprisonment there. In contrast to Galatians, both Philemon and Philippians contain clear references to the imprisonment. And many scholars today just take the introduction by Udo Schnelle, this is a German introduction, Einleitung in the Neue Testament. And Udo Schnelle lists many scholars today who simply follow the ancient tradition. It was also the tradition of the fathers of the church, that Paul was imprisoned in Rome, and during this imprisonment, he wrote these letters, Philemon and Philippians. We have many elements there, the terminology of praetorium, and then the reference to Caesar's household, and so on. Many Roman elements, especially in Philippians. And similar terminology between Philemon and Philippians. I once wrote a commentary on Philemon, and I know that the terminology is almost the same. It recurs from Philippians, from Philemon to Philippians. So I think that were written at approximately the same stage. So I would argue that they were simply written in Rome. We know no other imprisonment in Paul's letters. It is only Luke who persuades us that Paul was also imprisoned in Caesarea. And we have the hypothesis, which is a modern hypothesis, that he was also imprisoned in Athens. But we have no clear references to any imprisonment there. So it's Lucan vision of his imprisonment that he was brought as a prisoner to Rome. So we have no second career. This is a problem in the pastorals, in the discussion concerning pastorals, that he was released and then he went somewhere and that he came back to Rome. No, he came to Rome just once as a free person, and we have references to this in pastorals. Pastorals, the author of pastorals, of Titus and 1st and 2nd Timothy, does not know Acts of the Apostles yet. So he does not know the Lucan invention of Paul as a prisoner coming to Rome. So he simply assumes, in agreement with Paul's letters, that he simply came to Rome as a free person and that he was imprisoned in Rome. It is only Luke who creates the problems that we have Paul imprisoned in Caesarea and then coming as a prisoner, but in fact almost as a prince or a high priest, very respected on the ship, who knew everywhere how the ship should be governed and so on and so on. He knows all the winds in the Mediterranean, so he's almost the best sailor there. So it's all Lucan invention that he came to Rome as a very, very, very respected prisoner. All these problems disappear if we simply take the letters to Philemon, Philippians as written from Rome, and the pastorals as reflecting his way from the east to the west, from his communities in the east to the west, going to Rome.
Were the pastoral letters only building on the information contained in Paul's 7 authentic letters, or did the author of the pastoral epistles have access to oral tradition or perhaps other texts that informed them?
No, I think that he had no other texts or traditions before him. What is also important, I think it was first Fuchs who first noted that the pastoral letters, which are usually regarded as simply a set of 3 letters, they are written in a certain way, which resembles Colossians and Ephesians, for example. They are made as as a kind of balance between Jewish Christian theology and Gentile Christian theology. Titus functions as a typical or model Gentile recipient of Paul's message, and Timothy functions as a model Jewish recipient of Paul's message. So these letters were written as a set of writings composed together to argue that Paul had two hands, the Jewish one and the Gentile one, so to say. Paul's theology comprised both directions, like First Thessalonians, typically Gentile letter, and Second Thessalonians, written later, to argue that he also knew the Jewish hypotheses, so to say, according to the Jewish ideas of the coming of the Messiah. So we have Colossians and Ephesians written in a similar way. Very similar letters, but Colossians is a purely Gentile letter, and Ephesians is a model Jewish letter. And the same we have in pastorals. So the author of these letters, the so-called pastorals, has a certain model in his mind, how to present Paul's message in both Gentile and Jewish terms. So his aim was purely theological. He did not record any particular traditions there. So he had no access to any extrapolae, or extrapolae, I mean, any other traditions that were recorded in Paul's letters. And it can be argued, I recently wrote a commentary on Acts, that the author of Acts, whom we call Luke, knew the pastoral letters, and he made use of them, especially in the description of Paul's activity in Ephesus. That he knew the letters of James and First Peter, the Ethiopic letters attributed to James and Peter, and he also knew the so-called pastorals, and he made use of them. So Acts is a late writing which makes use of numerous other works of the New Testament: Paul's letters, pastorals, James, First Peter, the Gospels of Mark and Luke, and so on. So the Acts of the Apostles is a kind of encyclopedia of the early Christianity, not because of access to some traditions, but because of access to the letters that were written earlier.
Where did Paul write the epistle to the Romans from?
It's a good question. In fact, we do not know it. We usually assume that he wrote Romans from Corinth, and I think that it is a good hypothesis that he wrote Romans from Corinth. But we have no clear evidence that it was written from Corinth. We usually assume, and I think it's a good assumption that he wrote from Corinth. Corinth. We should remember that Corinth was the capital of the Roman province of Achaia. It was a very important Roman city there. It was much more important than Athens. First Thessalonians was written from Athens, in contrast to the opinions of most modern scholars who argue that First Thessalonians was written from Corinth. If we take the letter itself, we only have Athens there. Nevertheless, I think that Romans was written from Corinth, also because of the Roman milieu of this highly Roman colony. It had a status of Roman colony. It was the capital of the Roman province of Achaia.
Does the book of Acts generally agree more with the Pseudo-Pauline letters, the Deutero-Paulines, and the pastorals than it does with the 7 authentic letters?
I think that neither with Paul's letters nor with the post-Pauline letters. Luke was an independent thinker. He knew a lot of things. I was really astonished when I first discovered that Luke knew the works that we today know from the Dead Sea Scrolls. He knew the halakhic ideas that are contained in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are not contained in the Torah, in the Pentateuch. And he knew such things. And he knew the classical literature, Homer, Euripides, and others, Aesop, for example. So he was a very, very intelligent person, a very well-educated person. person, and he had access to numerous early Christian works. I mean, both the Pauline letters and the post-Pauline letters, and he wanted to create a work that would be persuasive to his audience. And this is the aim that he describes at the beginning of the Gospel, that he should bring asphalia, so certainty, reliability, to a certain Theophilus. We do not know this Theophilus. Nevertheless, the aim is clear. So I think that Luke was not compelled by his sources to write something that would simply record the data, the historical data. The biblical writings are generally not written to record any historical data, in contrast to our modern opinions. Today, we want to treat the biblical writings as recorded history. I must say that their aim was primarily theological, persuasive, rhetorical. They persuade us that the things happened in such a way. We can only take the issue of the number of the journeys of Paul to Jerusalem, with which I started the question. How many times did he go to Jerusalem? In Paul's letters, we only have 2 journeys. In the Acts of the Apostles, we have 5 journeys. So how many? Luke simply multiplied them for his theological reasons, and there are no traditions between so many journeys to Jerusalem. It is only his aim. He wanted to present Paul as being always in agreement with the Jerusalem believers, and he wanted to present the church as being always in peace. There's only one exception at the beginning of Acts 15, and there's a great dispute with 2 words that for Luke are clearly exceptional, that there was no small dissent among the believers in Antioch, which is for Luke a great thing. Normally, everyone lives in peace with another one in the church, which is clearly theological. It's not history.
When do you think Paul died?
When we come to absolute chronology, the only real point of reference that we have is Aretas, the ruler of the Nabateans, who died in AD 40, and we know that Paul's call and later Paul's flight from Damascus occurred during his life. So if we take the call 3 years before the flight from Damascus, then Paul must have received his calling no later than in AD 37. I argue that it happened earlier because I argue that his enigmatic flight from Damascus occurred when the Nabateans had more influence in Damascus, which is strange. What did they do in Damascus? The Nabateans lived in modern Jordan, if you know Petra. This was their kingdom. What did they do in Damascus, in Syria? It's a riddle that we do not have a good answer to. Nevertheless, we can assume that after the death of Herod Antipas, they had more influence in Damascus in AD 36. So I argue that Paul's calling happened in AD 33 and his flight from Damascus 3 years later in AD 37. If we add 14 years to this 33, we end up in 47 as the second visit in Jerusalem, 47. And I think that he died approximately 2 years later. The pastorals suggest that he spent the winter there on his way to Rome, and that he needed some winter clothes in Rome. So I think that there were 2 winters, no more, before his death in Rome. So I argue that he died in AD 47, which means if Acts was written around 130, 140, that we have at least 8 years between the events and the story that was written. 8 years, 2 generations. And that is why I argue that Luke had no independent traditions. He only had writings before him. It was 8 years, which is a very, very long period of time between the events and the story that Luke wrote 80 or 90 years later.
Do you think Paul died approximately in the ballpark of AD 49 or
Yes,
close to it.
yes, but as I said before, the only real point of reference for absolute chronology, I discussed here the relative chronology. The only clear point of reference is Aretas, the ruler of the
Yeah.
Nabateans. Everything else is more or less academic guess. And I make this guess, and I argue that it happened 14 years after his call. If his call occurred in AD 33, then his second visit took place in AD 47. And if we add 2 more years for his coming to Rome and being imprisoned there and dying there, then we end up in AD 49. In my book, I try to make some other arguments concerning the feigning or the expulsion of the Jews from Rome. But today, many years after this book, I would say that these arguments, okay, I still argue that they are important. Nevertheless, I wouldn't claim that they solve all our problems. They are more based on the data that we have in Acts than in the letters themselves. In the letters themselves, we have no reference to any faith. His journey to Jerusalem is occasioned by revelation and his need to resolve the tension between him and the Jerusalem pillars. And in his own letters, we have no clear references to any faith. Moreover, in his letters, we have no references to any expulsion of the Jews from Rome. We know that there were some expulsions, but it's very difficult to make a combination here. So I wouldn't argue that the absolute chronology is crucial for our understanding of Paul. That is why I concentrate my thinking on the relative chronology, because it helps us understand Paul and his thinking and his letters. And as a background, it helps us understand Luke and what he did with the data that he found in those letters. So in this way, we understand the New Testament. And whether Paul died in AD 49 or 59, it's not of crucial importance to us.
In either case, do you suspect that the book of Acts is adding more, making more, well, let me rephrase, is extending Paul's life? For instance, it's making him go to Jerusalem 5 times, not 2 times. So is it in other ways extending Paul's life, making it seem like he lived longer than he actually did?
Yes, I think so. Because Luke wanted to have more journeys to Jerusalem. And in fact, we have the same issue in the Gospel. I wrote in my book also about the Gospel of Luke, that especially at the beginning, now we are after Christmas here, and especially in the beginning, in the so-called Nativity story, we have various characters traveling to Rome, traveling to Jerusalem, time and again, to Jerusalem, to Jerusalem, to Jerusalem. And we have the same model, so to say, in the Acts of the Apostles, to Jerusalem, to Jerusalem, to Jerusalem, and again and again and again, which is not real, it is not historical. It is look fascination with the Old Testament idea of pilgrimage to Jerusalem as a sanctuary. Moreover, it is his way of resolving the tensions in the early church by arguing that Paul, every several years, came to Jerusalem and there were no great problems between him and the Jerusalem pillars. And that is why it can be argued that he somehow extended Paul's life. He made it longer than it was in reality. Yes, you're right.
Is it also doing this and getting some of its information from Josephus in the process of extending Paul's life? Like, for instance, when it briefly talks about that Paul was confused with the Egyptian, and then the Roman commander, I think it was Claudius Lysias, it's like, oh, he's not the Egyptian, let him go. And Josephus, of course, talks about the Egyptian.
Yes. Luke, the author of Acts, of course, he made use of Josephus. And this is one of my arguments, that he made use of Josephus' writings. He knew Josephus' writings, which were very influential at that time, because they supported the rise of the Flavian dynasty in Rome. So they were supported by the Romans. It was not a purely Jewish issue. So Josephus was supported by Romans, by the Roman dynasty, imperial dynasty. And that is why Luke made use of the writings of Josephus. What is more interesting is that Josephus probably, it is one of my arguments, that he probably mentions, maybe not directly Paul, but the travels made by Paul in Rome. We have the so-called Testimonium Flavianum in the book 18 of the Jewish antiquities. And then after this Testimonium Flavianum, which is partly authentic, I would argue, we have a very, very strange story, which ends up in 1881 to 84, in which there are some troubles are described in Rome caused by some people who gathered money. They made wrong use of this money. Instead of bringing this money to Jerusalem, they appropriated this money to themselves, and so on and so on. He does not name Paul. Nevertheless, there are some similarities here. Paul also, so to say, appropriates some money for himself. As I argued in Galatians, we have some remarks concerning the money which now should not go to Jerusalem. The money now should go to Paul. And probably, money is a very important factor in the theological discussions. It's a very important issue in church history. So if he touched not simply the matter of justification, but also the flow of money from Jerusalem to his own needs, because he was imprisoned in Rome, then Josephus could have regarded this activity of Paul as in highly negative terms. And I think that what we have here in Josephus' Antiquities, book 18, 81 to 84, is a slight allusion to Paul's activity in Rome. Someone who came from Jerusalem to Rome, a scoundrel who came from Jerusalem to Rome, he appropriated money for himself and so on and so on. So I think that he probably alludes to Paul and his companions in this activity, in his story about the troubles that happened to the Jews in Rome. And that is why they were expelled from Rome and so on. So it is interesting that we have not only a remark concerning Jesus, but a probably remark concerning Paul in Josephus' writings.
What do you make of Paul saying that among the many sufferings that he suffered in 2 Corinthians, he also mentions having 3 shipwrecks? What do you
Yes.
think about that, about his claim that he had 3 shipwrecks?
Okay, before I answer this question, I'll just follow up with the preceding one. It's also interesting that Josephus presents this enigmatic character as coming from Jerusalem to Rome, not as a prisoner, but as a free person. So we would have another attestation to this idea that Paul came as a free person from Jerusalem to Rome, if it refers to Rome. Now, concerning shipwrecks and so on, we have such a remark in 2 Corinthians, and I think that Luke, in his description or depiction, better to say, of Paul, used this remark in his story, but he combined it with the story that he found in Josephus' life. At the beginning of Josephus' life, in I think it's book 1, 16 to 18, that he also describes his voyage to Rome and a shipwreck that occurred to him in the Mediterranean. And of course, he used the classical models taken from the Odyssey. So he combined several sources. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, then Josephus writing his own Vita, his own bios, and his boasting that he was shipwrecked and nevertheless he came to Rome, and then also the classical model, which was used several times also in the New Testament, of the famous shipwrecks of Odysseus. So I think that we have a combination of these remarks in the Acts of the Apostles. Why in Paul? Because Paul mentions many hardships that he endured. And I think that shipwreck is one of them. It is quite plausible at the time. Please remember that the ships that were used at that time, 2,000 years ago, were not as reliable as we have now. There was no GPS, there was no engine, the diesel engine, and so on and so on. They sailed quite close to the shore. People generally did not go straight through the sea. Generally, people tended to be quite close to the shore. If something happened, for example, a thunderstorm or a strong wind, they could always come to the shore, which was also not problematic because the Mediterranean shores are rocky. So coming to the shore does not mean that you come to a safe place. So a shipwreck is a relatively, I would say, frequently occurring phenomenon in ancient navigation. So it is not implausible that Paul endured a shipwreck during his life. He traveled between Asia and Achaia, modern Turkey and modern Greece, probably using a ship, which went from one island to another island. And it was not as safe as it is today, when we use fast ferries coming from Bodrum, for example, to Athens and so on.
And my last question, what do you make of the reference in 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16? Specifically, it's about verse 16, about the wrath of God coming upon the Judeans. What was Paul referring to there?
Thank you. It's a good question. I think that he was simply angry at his Jewish opponents, and he makes them guilty of almost everything, killing prophets, killing Jesus. But what is the main rhetorical aim? That he accuses them of hindering him in his missionary activity to the Gentiles. So this is the main problem here, that they hindered his going with the gospel to the Gentiles. And I think that the wrath of God in his mouth came upon them because they stopped the plan that he understood it was God's plan to bring the gospel of Jesus' resurrection to all the world. If they opposed this plan, then it was according to Paul, it was the main event in the history of humankind. Jesus' death and resurrection, and the gospel should be brought to the whole world, to the whole humankind. And if the Jews hindered the proclamation of this gospel to all the people in the world, so they were guilty before God. And God's wrath was, I would say, an understandable consequence of their opposition to the main event in the history of humankind. So I would say that he simply followed the theology of the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy, for example, in which people who oppose God's plans are simply cursed. And I wouldn't say that there was a particular event behind it. It was simply a scriptural curse. It was an expression of God's wrath, simply as he called it, God's wrath against them, the people who opposed God's main plan towards humankind, which was the bringing of the good news of Jesus' resurrection to the world.
I would like to remind everybody that I have a link to Bartosz's book in the description below. It's titled Heirs of the Reunited Church, and it will also be in the pinned comment below. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Bartosz.
Thank you very much as well. It was a very interesting discussion here.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.